And so we are gathering to discuss next steps in terms of how do we move from this space of discussion and potentially into a space of action, but also exploring how do we want to gather together in the future, or to make what emerges from this space essentially. A lot of people also are not quite aware of who you are. So if it's okay with you, you probably hear this every time you join a call. I wanted to just read out your bio to them, just to give them a sense of who you are and why we've asked you to join the call. We did do a bit of an intro just before, but I thought it'd be important for us to just do that more formally for everyone instead of the conversations that's happened here and there. So I'm reading your bio from your website. So today we have Olúfẹ Táíwò. He's an associate professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. He received his PhD in philosophy at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has published in academic journals ranging from Public Affairs Quarterly, One Earth, Philosophical Papers, and the American Philosophical Association newsletter, Philosophy and the Black Experience. Táíwò's theoretical work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, anti-colonial thought, German transcendental philosophy, contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social science, and histories of activism and active thinkers. His public philosophy includes articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism, has been featured in The New Yorker, The Nation, Boston Reviews, Dissent, The Appeal, Slate, Al Jazeera, The New Republic, Aeon, and Foreign Policy. And he's the author of Elite Capture and Reconsidering Reparations. And so, like I said, it's thanks to, well, let's first just give a clap for that. So thank you for all of your contributions to the world in those areas. And then we will hand over to you unless there's any questions you have for us before you get started. Okay.
All right. Thanks for having me, y'all. I want to start by saying, so I got started working on this topic when I was organizing, man, I guess maybe a decade ago at this point. But I was working with people in the Graduate Workers Union and in the Sanctuary City movement in LA and racial justice movements in LA, where I lived at the time. And at the same time, I was studying philosophy, all the abstract stuff that you do in that discipline. And it was kind of trying to connect what I was thinking about on the book side of things with what I was thinking about on the organizer side of things that got me into this topic. Because, reparations, reparatory justice is a thing a lot of people were clamoring for. They've been clamoring for it for generations, but there seemed to be a lot of disagreements about what progress would look like, and what it would mean to actually move towards reparations. Different spaces talked about it in different ways, seem to have different goals. And so that's one of the things that I was trying to sort out in the book on reparations, just what I thought about those things and, maybe trying to offer up a way of thinking about it that would be useful to other people trying to make that same decision for themselves. So one of the questions y'all asked me to talk about was two of the distinctions that I made in different ways of thinking about reparations. But I think it's useful to think about all three of them, so I'll just talk about all three of them. But broadly, there are three categories that I used to kind of sort different ways of thinking about reparations and reparations projects. One was that I called the harm repair perspective. So those people that think the point of reparations is to make the recipients of reparations better off. The people who are getting reparations have been harmed by the history of slavery, colonialism, and racism, and we're trying to make them whole. So it's the way of thinking about reparations that's often common in law schools, because it maps onto things like tort law. If somebody, busted your car, how much would the repair cost? That's what the judge will ask that person to give to the person with the busted car, right? So it's that kind of logic, that kind of accounting. So a number of people that have written about reparations will go through and calculate the value of enslaved people's labor power in essentially stolen wages and come up with a number for reparations there. And there are some upsides to thinking about reparations in that way, but there are some drawbacks as well. I'm happy to talk about those, but for now, I'll just move on to saying that's the first category of reparations. The second category is relationship repair. So this way of thinking about reparations doesn't stress my welfare or my wealth or my the number of acres of land that I own has been harmed by reparations. Instead, it is my ties to the community that have been harmed by the history of slavery and colonialism, and or it's my community's ties to the state or ties to the land, as you often see on the indigenous sides of these issues, but also, in different countries' contexts where, land politics is a bit more tied into reparations, as you might see in Brazil or Colombia, right? So this way of thinking about reparations says the point of reparations isn't to, repair some stolen physical object, or restore a level of wealth that we calculate in some kind of accounting style. But the point is to issue apologies, to mend fences, to heal a broken relationship that's been broken by the injustice of slavery and colonialism and the unwillingness of countries, communities, and in some cases, neighbors to reckon with that history. So what we want out of reparations might less be cash transfers, as you might think on the harm repair view, and might be more like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or it might be a national reckoning with the history of slavery and colonialism, or something in that vein. So those are two ways of thinking about reparations that are popular. Obviously, people that like some of the ideas that are associated with one often like some of the ideas associated with the other. It's not some hard, fast division, but they are at least different points of emphasis. The way of thinking about it that I prefer is a third way that I called the constructive view of reparations. And the kind of point of departure, the way that you get started thinking about that view is thinking about the harm in a different way. It's not as though slavery and colonialism just took the world that already existed and added injury to it, or added harm to it, or added injustice to it. Obviously, it involved injustice, but what is, I think, particularly important and sobering about the particular campaign for reparations for transatlantic slavery and colonialism is that these particular injustices actually built the world, right? These particular injustices are the thing that explains why we have a world system, why we have a planetary system of economics and politics. And they explain not everything, but a lot about the basic features of that system, where the wealth is, where the power is, where the institutions are located, so on, so forth, right? So if you have that perspective, then I think way of thinking about the project of reparation that matches that is a rebuilding project. So it's not just making individual households whole. It's not just repairing relationships between communities of plundered and marginalized people and particular nation states or particular countries or particular other populations, but it's really about those things in addition to rebuilding the basic political features of the world itself, the balance of power between nations, all these bigger scale kind of ideas. And you see, just to give a quick example, you see that kind of broader view in the CARICOM 10-point program, which some of you, I imagine, are probably familiar with, right? They do call for the repair of cultural institutions. They do call for psychological rehabilitation. They do address some of the relationship and individual or community level harms. Obviously, no reparations project could or should avoid talking about those things. But they pair those things next to point 9 of the 10-point plan as a technology transfer. Point 10 of the 10-point plan is large-scale debt cancellation for Caribbean nations. Why? Because these things change the balance of power between the entire populations of people that live in Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago and, say, the World Bank, the IMF. It's these things affect political power on a planetary scale. And so I like that third view, and I'm happy to say more about it, but I'll just address a couple of the other questions that were put to me, and then I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. I think the elephant in the room, and this is the kind of thing I was thinking about a bit while I wrote the book, was, we're not in a moment like the historical moment that kind of inspired the view that I'm writing about, right? A lot of the people that I was taking my cues from and learning from and adopting this view on the basis of, as I talk about in the book, are the kinds of people who are active in the wave of anti-colonial movements in the 1950s through the 1970s, right? There was a real sense that the world could be reshaped on a planetary scale because they were actually doing it, right? Most of the world was under the colonial control of a handful of empires at the start of the 20th century. And the same people who were thinking of a new international economic order, as they called it, the same people who were thinking of reshaping global trade relations, the same people who were thinking of making Africa a united political bloc that would, operate as a peer rather than as a dominated section of the world. These same people who were pushing these ideas were also winning wars of national independence with these other actors. And the situation we're in now, the post-Brexit Trump 2.0 Modi and the BJP Orban, this moment is one where globally, it's the right that is kind of seizing the initiative politically, and it's not clear what that means for reparations movements. Um, I think a thing people who are interested in the project of reparations should be um, thinking about are the kinds of proposals that are being brought up and discussed in groups like Progressive International, which has also kind of marked the 50th anniversary of the new international economic order with a sort of retrospective asking, what would it take to get in, 2025, the kind of vision and optimism about reshaping the world at scale that you saw in 1974. And it might take a lot of South-South cooperation. On the issue of reparations specifically, we are starting to see, at least at the international level, government to government, that kind of cooperation from CARICOM and the African Union, at least making some waves about thinking about reparations together, but it's unclear how they're going to force um, ideologically an ideologically inhospitable environment in a lot of these other countries to take these concerns seriously unless they're prepared to act as a block somehow, right? A lot of materials that are important to the global energy transition that needs to happen are exist in abundance on the African continent. In general, in the global south is going to account for a larger share of the world economy, a larger share of global demand for goods. There's a lot of hardball that the countries of the global south could play if they were, disposed to work together, but I think that's what it's going to take. So that's my perspective on, how we should start to think and talk about reparations in the context of right-wing ultranationalism. The one other thing I'll say before moving to something else is that, this kind of project, this scale of project always had to be a long-term set of commitments, long-term set of projects. Even if you thought reparations should be victims of generational racist injustice receiving a check or receiving land, or even if you thought it was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, no matter what your view of reparations is, building the political will to enact it is a sort of thing that we know for sure that would take generations because generations of people have been pushing for it, right? We're not by any means the first to think about this or the second or the third, right? So I don't think the fact of right-wing ultranationalism in the US and Europe should make us drop this so much as it should make us serious about, what a long-term commitment looks like and how we can act towards that, even in a time where in the short term, it seems like the options are limited. The last thing I'll say a little bit about before I shut up is I was asked to say a little bit about movement dynamics following the elite capture framework. So elite capture is another thing that I've written about. Elite capture basically just means when the advantaged few within a group get control over the lion's share of the resources for that group and or of the political agenda for that group. So to call myself out a little bit, the examples I just gave about what movement towards reparations looks like were very top-heavy examples, right? What CARICOM as an institutional body thinks about reparations and what the African Union as an institutional body thinks about reparations. But, I think lots of people on the grassroots side of reparations activism, like yourselves, rightfully have criticisms of those bodies and of the states that put them together. You know, is the Nigerian government or the Kenyan government, or the Malian government or the Jamaican government, you know, the best place to decide what reparations should look like on the international scale? Are they responsive to the people that live in all those places in the right kind of ways? You know, I think in a lot of cases, the answer is no. And so that is a tension, that's a problem, that's a political problem that sits next to the problem of how to win reparations at all, right? How would we win a version of it that meaningfully works for people, for Black people, for Indigenous people, for whoever it is that we're fighting for to receive reparations, if the institutions doing the fighting don't really reflect what's going on in the whole, or certainly at the bottom of those groups, the people who are most disenfranchised, most dispossessed, who are the poorest. Um, I think, you know, that's a thing we need to think creatively about as well. Um, the thing I'll say for now, just to conclude this section of the discussion, is I think the easiest way to make the problem visible and to make progress on the problem is to contest the political agenda itself, right? So, what's a 10-point program look like in the context of the African diaspora in Europe, in the UK? As you contest the substance of that, you know, here are the things we think are most important. I think naturally the question of who gets to decide which 10 are the most important kind of flow from there. And so it might be the most productive way of challenging whatever entrenched power structures one is up against. But I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say about this. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I also want to say thank you for coming. I'm very aware I didn't say that at the beginning. If I did, I don't remember. And it was interesting to hear how you've broken down the 3 points. And at some point during the conversation, you had suggested that if we wanted, you were be open to elaborating a bit more on the constructive view. And I wondered, how did everyone else feel about hearing more about that perspective? And then we can go into a Q&A. Yeah. Is that okay with you?
Yeah. So I'll just say a little more about the constructive view. One of the things I stress in the book is that construction is not a metaphor. I literally mean we should look at reparations as a construction project. And the context I explore most directly in the book is in response to the problem of the climate crisis. Right now, a lot of the explanation of the difference in vulnerability, the racially unjust, the economically unjust difference in vulnerability comes down to what structures are going to be hit by climate crisis and how robust they are, right? So, how efficient and effective is wastewater management in a city? Literally, where are the trees located? Particularly in the South in the US, there's a very stark divide of where trees are located based on the racial composition of a neighborhood. And, that might not sound important by itself, but once climate-induced heat waves start, what people will quickly come to realize is the distribution of trees in a city is also the distribution of temperature in a city, which means the people with the most pavement and the least trees are going to be most vulnerable to heat stroke, which we've already seen in past heat waves in the past few years. And unfortunately, I think we can expect to continue to see. We don't necessarily always need to mean construction of physical things like trees and sewage systems and seawalls to protect from flooding. But we could think about how insurance schemes are built and managed. So disaster aid institutions and policy structures, insurance policy structures, particularly around disaster insurance, are other things that decide who is going to be disadvantaged when floods happen, when heat waves happen, when wildfires happen, and who's going to be protected by institutions. Those institutions are also things that we have to build. And right now, the people building them are the right. Or in the case of the US, the people dismantling them. But what will exist in the wake of that is a very dystopianly unequal level of vulnerability to all of the crises that are going to come with climate change. But obviously, this logic isn't just about climate, right? It's these same institutions, it's these same transit structures, these same housing structures, where they're built, who they're built for, who they are managed and refined for, that explain inequality pretty generally, that explain injustice pretty generally. And so I think it's these kinds of things that we should be thinking about from a reparations perspective as well.
Cool. Thank you so much for elaborating. I guess, should we open up the floor for questions?
Sat around and can hear the question.
Um,
Hang on, see anyway.
It's on mute.
Sorry, I could unmute, but you'd have to turn the volume down as well.
Yeah. No, just need to unmute, you unmute.
No, you have to turn your speaker off as well. Yeah.
That's okay. Bear with us.
No worries.
Yeah, sorry about this. Yeah, my name is Saurabh. Nice to meet you. Thanks for finding the time. I have a couple of questions for you. The first one is in relation with the distinction that you draw between the second perspective that you talked about, the relational one, and the third one, the construction one, the constructivist one. So I wondered whether if we approached a relational perspective on the third, right? So construction just doesn't happen out of nowhere. Construction requires relations. So if the relations that have been severed or damaged might need to be repaired in order to build another world that you're after. So it's not to distinguish the second from the third, but to put them together where we bring the relations along and talk about relations as necessary to build new world. And second is sort of tied in with that, which is, what if when the modern world was being built out of colonial injustices and slavery and all of that, they were at the same time other worlds that were being damaged and destroyed. So some of those worlds, fortunately for us, are alive and kicking today. And we want to be able to think about those worlds as actually existing and having a need for them in the future. They are not disposable worlds. They are worlds we need for our own survival in the future. So therefore, having just this one world perspective on reality, how limiting or how sort of modern and colonial itself is, that we don't think about other worlds when we think about even reparations.
That's right.
So those are my two questions for you.
Yeah, good. Thank you. On the first one, I agree. And the way that the way that I kind of draw a contrast in the book is a lot of the people arguing in academic journals for something like the relational perspective are not giving quite the same gloss on it that you are. So I would certainly agree that, without the right kind of political relationships, people aren't going to agree to do the work of fighting injustice, right? Whether they line up in favor of injustice or just are indifferent, you're not going to win the political battles that it takes to reconstruct the world unless you change something about how people relate to each other. The thing that I'm contrasting the constructive view with is not a view that relationships are important. The view I'm contrasting the constructive view with is a view where repairing relationships is itself the target or itself the goal of reparations, right? So there are people that argue that what reparations should be for is to issue apologies and to rebuild trust between people, not for the purpose of pursuing another political project that requires that trust, but only or principally motivated by the independent value of that trust between people. It's as if to say that, if you know, black and white people, just to use one example, or if settlers and indigenous people just could get along, that the goal of reparations would be achieved. And that's the perspective I disagree with. But I certainly agree that if you're going to do reconstruction, then you're going to need to change relationships. I think that's right. On the second view, I don't know. Some of this I think is terminological. It's certainly true that there were many worlds before colonialism, and there still are many worlds in a sense of world. If there is one thing that I'm drawing my attention to, then in the context of the climate crisis, it is the planet. We do only have one of those, and emissions from the colonial world of the U.S. Pentagon drive up temperatures, in the indigenous world of the Lakota Nation, regardless of how we count those worlds. And so the thing that I am insisting on with the one world, one construction project is the connectivity between the many worlds that there are. But I do, particularly in like Latin American politics, there's often valorization of an idea of kind of pluriversalism, or a world in which many worlds can fit, that kind of conception of what it is to do large scale politics. And I very much am on that team. I don't think the construction project should result in a one world, or needs to result in a one world government where everybody votes on everything or something. I think I would hope for a version of rebuilding the world that did embrace differences between people and different connections to different places, and different worlds, we could say, but we can only do that by fixing the one planet that we all share, and we have to conceive of the fact that we all share the one planet to make sense of the problems that stop us from having one world in which many worlds can fit.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I've got a question. Do I come up there?
That's probably.
Oh, yeah. Hey, yeah, thank you so much. Really amazing. One like piece of our particular inquiry is about kind of land as a site of reparations, and in the UK, you know, land access is like hugely challenging. There's huge disparities in land ownership. This is another legacy of kind of how colonialism shaped the world here. And, you know, maybe in like an indigenous context, land back can be that kind of, and I guess that the point is that the severing of people from the land is a huge part of what is lost through colonialism. So in the context of like diasporic peoples living now in this land, we land back in the same sense doesn't work, but like what can we be doing to like reconnecting to land and like rebuilding the kind of belonging and like spiritual and material sustenance that can happen again through having that relationship. Yeah, I hope that's clear enough. Yeah.
I think that's a really great point. And you know, a lot of my friends on the Indigenous studies side of things have also, you know, made this point over the years to me. I Speaking about the UK in particular, you know, I think obviously, you know, the politics of land back won't work the same way there than here. But to your point, I think there is something independently politically valuable about making land a central idea of what we're trying to heal, reconstruct our relationship with. And I think the context of the climate crisis puts a underline under that point, right? You know, it's intimately related to the fact that we're willing to destroy the planet, that we've developed a political system that severs people's connections to it. So broadly, the two genres of things I think about in this kind of different context than the US would be sort of natural resource politics, you know, in the UK, water in particular and water management, but in general, the kind of political pressure around what would ordinarily be kind of here we call it permaculture, you know, the people that are really interested in soil politics and gardening and doing all those things on a small scale. I think those same ideas, those are great activities to do and they are potentially part of a larger scale kind of commitment. If more people are invested in the quality of their soil and the water cycle and what's going on with those things, there being a clear political side to that in the context of water being privatized, right? I think you can develop a different political relationship to land, water, soil, air. So I definitely think trying to develop some connections there would be helpful. And doing that in the context of, I think, a sort of economic flavor to things. So La Via Campesina has a lot of support for agroecology and in general a more politically and culturally and justice orientation to farm production, small scale and large. And you see radical movements in other places, maybe the best example being the landless workers movement in Brazil, managing to unite, some agroecological types of ideas of how food should be produced and how the soil should be taken care of with a broader political agenda of who should have land and who should get to make decisions about how land and water and soil and air are managed. And these are ways into thinking about all of the justice questions of politics that I think tie us to the land and not just party politics and tax politics. And, MST in particular, that's the Brazilian landless workers movement, I think would be really worth a look and seeing, what parts of what they're doing resonate with your situation.
Thank you. Great question. There was another question that was coming from the side of the room.
Hi there, Olúfẹ. Wonderful to hear from you. Really enjoyed your works. I'm super delighted. This is me playing it cool. So I wanted to talk or ask a little bit about, I guess that in this political moment, it feels like the world over we are being subject to corporate coups.
Yeah.
And I think there is something which feels perhaps more crystallized here than or now than has been in the past. And now when we are thinking about the harms to people and planet, we can see and identify very clearly the role that corporate power structures are playing in driving that destruction and in driving the concentration of power, resource, in very tangible and harmful ways. And I wondered if there was kind of anything percolating at the moment for you around how the concept of strict liability might be deployed within reparations movements to shift some of that focus towards fighting the concentration of corporate power. And I guess as part of that, maybe like how we might think about also applying more pressure to the left more generally to stop ruling out that fight as being impractical or not unwinnable, to really underscore it's central to this moment. So I don't know if there's any thoughts, but yeah, thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you. So one thing I think is particularly clear in the US context is the tight tie between the kind of cultural backlash towards anti-racism and the corporate coup, right? I think President Trump just tweeted today about amnesty for all South African farmers or something. So they're not being especially subtle about it over here. Elsewhere in the world, it might be a little subtler, but I think in general, on the right, there is an understanding of what corporate control means that is not just we get all the money, which of course is, reason number one, I suppose, but we get to make all the decisions. And the thing that they resented about feminism, the thing that they resented about DEI, I think, besides just generally that a lot of these people are racist and misogynist and all the other stuff, But also I think these forces represented a modicum of restraint and control over what they could do to their workers, what they could subject their workers to. Right? You know, the powerful guy, you get to decide where factories get shipped, and suddenly you're on a board meeting and you have to use pronouns you wouldn't ordinarily use, right? Or something like that, right? It sounds small to us, but these guys flip the fuck out over that, right? And the consequences of that we're now seeing in the various parts of the world that are controlled by the right wing, which now includes the US. And we're seeing that in a lot of we're seeing a friendliness to that, or at least a skepticism about the ability to fight the cultural rise of the right, certainly from the center left in the US and the Democratic Party, certainly from the Labour Party in the UK. You know, I certainly from even the Workers' Party in Brazil, you know, but I think they're doing better than the rest of us. There's a real sense, even on, you know, what you could call the left, electorally speaking, in the world, about the potential to win on cultural issues, even as the particular nature of the corporatist right that they're fighting have made it clear that there's a unity between the kind of pro-corporate coup and the right-wing cultural ascendancy that they're trying for. So I'm not sure exactly how to pressure the left into seeing that they need to fight both of these battles. You know, the battle against corporate overlords and the battle against, you know, right-wing bigotry, other than to show them that that decision has been made for them by the right. Right. You know, the fact that these corporate oligarchs installing themselves have simply made it part of their set of goals to eliminate trans people from public life, to eliminate women from positions of power, et cetera, et cetera. It just is the nature of the opponent on the other side. And I don't think becoming a light, you know, a junior version of the bigot on the other side is a winning electoral strategy, even setting aside the morality. So, you know, I suppose that's what I would say to a party operative who was wondering what strategy to take. But, you know, I'm as perplexed as everyone else in this moment, I guess. I'm still trying to think through it myself.
Hmm. Hmm. Any other questions?
Doesn't be in chat.
I know.
can ask a question.
No, I'll ask one. Can I ask a second one?
Okay, so Tom, Andrew, Thorough.
Hi, yeah, really grateful for your time, Olúfẹ. I wanted to ask something about, I'm Tom. I wanted to ask something about narratives because I've been working as part of the Seeding Reparations initiative with people racialized as white, and some of them are sympathetic in principle, but once they've got beyond the sort of initial apprehension that reparations means like sending the money they'd promised their grandchildren off to Africa, and you talk that through, and it's like it's actually about reconstruction. I think often we're coming across this sort of reaction of like particularly we're talking to working class white communities. So like, well, the Industrial Revolution also created intergenerational inequality in our communities, and like how far back are we going to go? And actually we had some feedback recently after we were at a conference from somebody saying, well, what about the clearances? You know, like my ancestors were da, da, da. And I just wondered, rather than like arguing about what is historically correct and like your three different strategies, do you have any advice, or can you point us anywhere for sort of like work around? And I guess it's maybe in the US, it's not all of it's applicable to Europe, but maybe some of it would be of sort of like how to talk through this sort of thing. Like we can all win, but at the same sense, you know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like people racialized and white in general have benefited a lot more from 400 years of European colonialism than global South and diasporas. Anyway, it's just maybe more of a thought than a direct question. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, one thing I like to do in response to that is just work backwards from proposals. And you know, obviously it will work for every proposal, but at least some of the things that I think, you know, recognizably would count as reparations ideas, reparations projects, make the point clear, you know. So it's one thing to say, as an intellectual matter, you know, we can all win, or we all have an interest in remaking the world away from a planet that's being destroyed. You know, I think people get that, but don't quite believe you. But say, so one of the examples that I discuss in the book as a concrete reparations proposal was proposed by Dorian Warren, who's a economist at the Economic Security Project. And he suggested, let's have a universal basic income with you know, a UBI plus. So people who are descended from people who were enslaved in America would get some additional reparations amount to that universal basic income, but it would be a universal basic income. So I would just start there, and I would say to the working class white person, if you get a universal basic income, are you better off or worse off? Right? You know, you know, has your problems failed to be acknowledged? You know, I think few people are going to go the extra mile to say, well, what happened to my ancestors was worse than chattel slavery. You know, people typically stop at, well, bad stuff happened to my ancestors too. And I don't see any need to fight those people or to fight that viewpoint. You know, Dr. Vereen Shepherd, who's at Paracom, you know, also, you know, makes this point. You know, if people, you know, if the people of the Irish diaspora wanted to call for reparations, you know, we're not the people that would fight them, right? You gotta take that up with whoever would, which I presume would be, you know, the English crown, right? So yeah, I think that's broadly what I would say. And but after that, then maybe I would try to pivot back to the broader lesson. Like, this is what I mean when I say, you know, the construction project could benefit everyone. I mean, concretely, if we make the world better, it is better for you, right? Person who lives in the world. And we can acknowledge that this world isn't equally unjust for everyone without saying, you know, I'm gonna take food out of your kid's mouth to put it in some other, like, those aren't the choices we're left with.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Unless there are nobody else has a question, so I can ask another.
One second.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your time, for sharing the space with us. You mentioned like the creation of the new international order and that being like just 50 years ago, but like predating that was the revolutionary movements, which also like shifted the international order. And you said that to like, again, I'm just paraphrasing, but like more South to South cooperation would be needed to actually enact or to, reworld or like build new worlds. What are some examples of like South to South cooperation that you've seen so far that you've personally viewed as successful, or like models that other I guess either organizations or just other nations could follow, like I guess maybe in the past few years, like South to South cooperation that you think are like productive models that others could follow?
So this goes beyond South to South, but it's, but it's an important historical example. I think the international pressure put on the South African apartheid regime and the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which included obviously a grassroots element, but also obviously governments cooperated as well. That's the kind of thing I think we see historically that could be a model for moving forward. And there's a movement of that kind today in response to Israel. Maybe the US will get added to the list given the developments of the president essentially proposing ethnic cleansing there. We'll see how that goes. But that's the kind of cooperation that the more kinds of institutions and whether it's state institutions or universities or professional organizations, the more traction that gets, the better off those movements are in terms of driving changes. One kind of perspective example that I'll give, this is out of the Progressive International's program of action that they released as part of their 50th anniversary of the new International Economic Order meeting and package, debtors clubs, right? So it's just the state version of the idea of a debtors union, right? If I owe the bank $1 million, that's a problem for me. If 1 million of us united owe the bank $1 billion, that's a problem for them, right? That kind of logic. States could do that. So if Colombia and Venezuela and Jamaica and Mali all formed a club and said, we're defaulting on our debt unless we get this kind of restructuring. That's something that not any of them could do on their own, but maybe working in a group, they could, force creditor nations, creditor institutions to the table and get them to do some cool stuff, maybe canceling the debt, maybe changing their investment patterns, possibly away from fossil fuels. The feasibility of that's going to depend on the country, but that's the flavor of idea that I'm thinking about.
Me again. And I think on this kind of topic of internationalism and solidarity, I wondered what elements of coloniality or colonial power should people like us who are in the colonial core understand as a responsibility to challenge, to with a view to making a truly kind of global reconstruction project for people and planet possible.
So a big thing I'm concerned about, in general, is making the kind of progress on reparations that causes positive rather than negative feedback. And what I mean by that is just the kind of thing, can we make the kind of wins that make future wins more likely? Or do we achieve these kind of Pyrrhic victories that come at a cost? So people in the diaspora push for, say, rematriation of art from the British Museum to Nigeria, let's say. I don't think that's a bad result by any means, and it's not a bad thing to push for. But in the context of, the broader question of to what extent state governments are meaningfully responsive to people, you might worry that, the state having, any particular state having a prominent role in receiving and making decisions about reparations transfers might be a kind of one step forward, two steps back kind of thing. And so for this reason in the book, among the things I talk about are different decision-making mechanisms, ones that are more thoroughly democratic. One concrete example of that being participatory budgeting. At the city level, you could make decisions about what to do with public funds in a kind of town hall format. You could also make laws that way. They have citizens' assemblies that essentially work as kind of junior legislative bodies. And you could have a set of political fights that are about how much power should these have? How much money goes through participatory budgeting rather than through the kind of standard government process? How many of the laws go through citizens' assemblies rather than, elected representatives? Those fights are, might seem like they're about this arcane procedural stuff, but they're about the distribution of political power in fairly direct ways. And I think it's especially important for those of us in the imperial core to try and win those battles where we're at, but also to, I think, try to make those battles winnable elsewhere, because I think that question of who decides and what decides is often one that gets displaced from relevance in favor of, just where is the money. But I prefer to think of those as a pair because they both do a lot of explaining in terms of how the world works and who benefits from how the world works. And I think it's it's a key feature of, maybe it's the key feature of coloniality. Whatever else colonialism was, it was a decision-making structure that was nakedly authoritarian. And to the extent that colonized people were represented at all. It was in these co-opted roles typically. And if we're gonna unmake that political structure, we need different political forms.
Anybody who hasn't asked a question that would like to ask a question before we continue on with round 2 of questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Olúfẹ. I have another quick question for you. I wonder what's happening in the US right now in order to build a larger momentum for the question of reparations. And what do you think should be done in addition to what's already happening to build this larger momentum? Beyond writing a book, obviously, and doing very well with it. Beyond all of that, what do you think should be done and what's already happening in the US context, for building a larger momentum? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a few things happening, almost all of which are subnational. So there are cities that are embarking on reparations projects, maybe most notably the city of Evanston, Illinois, with a kind of housing-based reparations set of projects that they've been rolling out. And they seem to have done well at making sure that that lasts. They've marked specific taxes for it. So, they've been doing some good long-term thinking about that kind of project. The state of California has both pursued land back, rematriation of lands to indigenous nations, and for the descendants of the enslaved, started some reparations proposals, although progress on that has hit some, the typical kind of legislative hurdles. But they've at least moved forward with studying that at the state level. I don't know how either will fare in the current administration federally. It might be that they continue at the state level and city level, but just don't expand nationally. There are conventions, people hold conferences and strategize about how to make it a national issue. But again, I don't know how those meetups will fare under the current administration. But there's a group called Taproot Earth in the Gulf South that both has a regional emphasis on the Gulf South, so like Louisiana, so Mississippi, that section of the United States, and also a broader connection to international justice movements, for climate justice, environmental justice. That section of the country is a big, is the lion's share of petroleum export. So there's a lot of environmental justice challenges with all the emissions and pollution that come with that industry, and they've had an appetite for linking that to international struggle. So that may be a route forward, at least in terms of how movements here connect to movements abroad. But it may end up skipping a level as far as national reparations projects.
Thank you. I guess I have a question in relation to even this gathering. Was there another question? Okay.
Yeah.
And it kind of follows up on that question in terms of what's happening stateside. But considering we're here gathering today, exploring, next steps and it feels like a very long journey, for reparations. Is there any advice or feedback, or nuggets of wisdom that you could share as we are in the early days and conversations of what could potentially emerge? Like in terms of, from experience, also as like others have come and, sometimes individuals come together, but then there's things that results in them dismantling and going to other ways, and all of that energy has been just kind of lost in a way. And so acknowledging that there are challenges that such gatherings can hold, is there, I guess, feedback in terms, from that perspective as well?
Yeah, I mean, in general, it's hard to keep political movements together, in the best of times. And on, yeah, it's difficult, but I would say the biggest thing to do at this stage would be to find a few examples of organizations that have done the kind of thing that you're trying to do. And studying how they've organized themselves internally and what goals they've pursued in what order. So there again, I would bring up the landless workers movement. And I would try to find at least a couple groups in your local area as well, because obviously, they're the ones that are responding to circumstances that'll be most like yours. But at least one group that shares the kinds of goals that you have, and one group that shares the kinds of circumstances that you have, even if they were, campaigning for something else. And then trying to work backwards from, or I suppose work forwards from what they did to what you all want to do.
I don't know if they're gonna follow that, that was such a positive. It's okay, all is well. Hi, thanks so much for joining. Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow up, I guess, in terms of taking action in this particular moment, and, there, at this moment of backlash where there have been, in the states, lawsuits, and bills against local reparations initiatives. And here too, there's been political pushback as well, and then sort of the control over kind of what terms we can use in teaching and education, and I guess so within that context, how to kind of create shared solidarity sort of across contexts, and different ways of sort of communicating with each other that push back against the kind of efforts by the right to not only oppress, but also kind of claim reparations for themselves. There's a use of reparations amongst the right now too, which is quite disturbing. And so how can we kind of hold space in this time? Thanks.
Yeah, I think to that last point, seeing the various statements of the current administration in the US about South Africa was especially sobering. I think I don't know that I have any, honestly, I wish I had a better answer, but I don't know that I have any ideas about how to respond to the right's co-optation of reparations. I don't know how committed they are to it. So, maybe that's something of a silver lining. But even the fact that they're emboldened enough to try suggests that they feel a certain level of cultural ascendancy. But I think the one idea, or I guess the one idea I do have, would be highlighting essentially the gap between them and us. And by them, I don't mean, your average person that's ideologically aligned with the right, but I mean the people really kind of calling the shots on the right, which are, these billionaires that I think no one really feels connected to. So sorry for how much US politics I'm throwing in, but when Luigi Mangione shot some random healthcare CEO, he became one of the most popular people in the country. And even a good number of people that would ordinarily and do ordinarily support the Republican Party, just were of the opinion that something is fucked up about healthcare CEOs. And you see the same kind of phenomenon, the early polling about Elon Musk. Even people who are otherwise in favor of Donald Trump don't necessarily like the idea of of some other billionaire being in charge of major aspects of the US government and so on and so forth. So in general, that's the thing I would try to highlight in every political context. Who are the people actually making all of these decisions, and making those people as visible as possible. Making it clear who's funding who and why, and making that the line of division, right? It's Team Luigi versus team CEOs, right? To put it in a crude way. But essentially trying to make that the central division. And then, I think a lot of these other divisions or differences of opinion become more tractable. People might be more receptive to hearing you out on the other stuff if they think if they have a clear set of villains that you clearly aren't.
Thank you. I'm mindful we're coming to time. Okay. Yeah, go for it.
Hi, my name is Javi. I'm from Colombia. And I don't know whether this question, comment that I'm going to try to formulate is going to come the right way. English isn't my first language, so I'm going to try and give it a go. Just coming back to, well, in the light of the pluri-world and the light of many worlds within the new world that we want to build, I tend to think that thinking a lot about the actual structures and the way that we relate to the actual structures and the way that the world is being laid out before our eyes tends to be like we are wasting quite a lot of time trying to fix it and trying to get to the points where make this kind of partisan politics work. And I wonder if from a reparative lens we should be looking at, and I'm talking about, and this is kind of the question that I want to formulate, from what are your opinions on the idea that people like me, for example, who are from the diaspora, who have kind of grown up in the UK, for example, in my case, who have learned to navigate certain spaces of power and privilege and who have become, in a way, able to gain funding and get money. I see myself as a reparative agent towards the communities and the community that I belong to back in Colombia. Here in the UK, as well as the diaspora, but back in, and not just Colombia, Latin America, and even Africa as such. So I wonder, what is your take on the individual responsibility of those of us that have these privileges of managing ourselves within both worlds? Whether there is a space for that, to be reparative agents as individuals, and also the further part of the question is, if so, what is your reparative stance as an individual yourself, if you have any, and can you talk a little bit about that? Is that come out right?
Yeah. Thank you. No, it's a great question. And I think about it a lot, it's one of the points I made in the Elite Capture book, right? What it means to be Nigerian American as I am really kind of depends on whether your context for that is Nigerian Americans or Nigerians, right? And I think it's a very different set of contexts. And I think the question of whether or not we individuals who can function in both worlds, or function in the imperial core, whether we are an advance for the broader reparations project, or if we are a further impediment to the broader reparations context, I think depends a bit on the decisions we make. And I think also on the ability of forces or organizers or institutions in, back home in Colombia, in Nigeria, wherever, to, for lack of a better term, capture us, right? Ideally, this isn't a thing that I'm, super comfortable saying, because, people in Nigeria have a lot of concerns to deal with. But in an ideal world, I would love to be in a situation where a bunch of Nigerians in Nigeria were trying to win me to an ideological side, right? Or trying to win me to a political project, right? Or trying to convince me and my friends, Nigerian Americans who grew up here, to support this or that. That doesn't always go well, right? A big part of the a big fuel for the troubles in Ireland was the support of Irish Americans, right? So it's not always going to work out in ways that are ideal. But as far as I can tell, I don't know, that every country is doing that. And to me, it seems like a missed opportunity because I think you're right. There is a possibility, there is a scenario where the people that can function in the imperial core but who have ties to these other countries are effective advocates for making conditions better for those countries, for advocating for those countries' interests in a way that's compatible for justice for all, right? Like, that's certainly a way things could go. But the ideal version of that would be with with some measure of accountability and discipline, right? I have to essentially guess or, take it upon myself to commiserate with particular people. I would have to guess at what Nigeria's interests are on the global scale, which is why you don't see me talking about that, because I don't know what they are, right? And so, yeah, I've kind of been beating around this, but what I think should happen is, there should be durable, ideally kind of institutionally driven, or at least, a culture of the diaspora relating to people in the home country and trying to do so in a productive, accountable way, politically. It shouldn't be just be people sending money to their aunt and uncle and that being the extent of it. But in a lot of places, or for a lot of countries, I think that is the extent of it. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it really was. Final comments, statements, thank yous, anything, anybody just wanting to get out of their chest before the call ends?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your words will resonate across the rest of the weekend. Thank you very much.
Yes,
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Next time we'll fly you over.
Well, I got family over there, so I'll be there one day.
Oh, cool.
We're gonna hold you to it.
Yep. All right, take care.
Thank
Thanks
you,
a
and have a
lot.
good
Take care.
day.
Yeah, Dave.
Yeah. Yes. Take care.
All right.